Teresa Ladrigan-Welpley, and I serve as the director of the Benin Institutes and Ignatian Spirituality and the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education. The work of the Ignatian Center is to exemplify and activate Santa Clara's Jesuit Catholic tradition of education through dialogue, reflection, and action. One of the ways in which we seek to do this is through the work of our thematic Benin Institutes, which host interdisciplinary faculty collaboratives, a podcast series, and public lectures and roundtable dialogues like this afternoon. Our present Benin Institute is framed around the question and call, is there a common good in our common home? A summons to solidarity. And this quarter, we focus in a particular way around issues of gender justice and the common good. Earlier this quarter, we hosted theologian Susanna Cornwall for our 2017 Santa Clara lecture, in which she inquired, should transgender and intersex be understood as anomalies, which don't fundamentally disrupt the model of two distinct and separate human genders, which map onto two distinct and separate human sexes as intended by God as part of the order of creation? Or alternatively, should we think or rethink our understandings of sex and gender, asking what constitutes a common good that is good for these embodied, divinely made, and God-imaging people too? Today, we pursue these questions of gender and gender justice a bit further with a very gifted panel of scholars and practitioners from biomedical, theological, anthropological, and public health perspectives, engaging questions of gender and gender justice today in light of the common good. To introduce our contributors, I'd like to invite up Sharmila Lodia, Associate Professor in Women's and Gender Studies and Benin Faculty Fellow in the Ignatian Center, who chairs our Benin Institute Gender Justice Faculty Collaborative. Sharmila.
Tip this down. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you all for being here. It's a really good feeling in this moment in time to walk into a room focused on gender justice and have a full room. So thank you all for being here. The Benin Institute Faculty Collaborative on Gender Justice and the Common Good is comprised of 6 faculty members from disciplines across the university who are convening over a 2-year period around research, teaching and university initiatives related to gender justice and the common good. 2 of our collaborative scholars are serving as respondents on today's panel, and all of us are here today to advance dialogue around this important subject. You can learn more about the work of each member of the collaborative through our contributions to the Benin Institute podcast, Integral, available through the Benin Institute website or wherever you get your podcasts. For now, let me introduce our speakers and get the conversation started. First, Dr. Stephen Rosenthal is a professor of pediatrics, director of the endocrine clinics, and founder and medical director of the Child and Adolescent Gender Center at the UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital in San Francisco. He is currently the principal investigator for an NIH-NICHD study on the impact of early medical treatment in transgender youth. Dr. Rosenthal earned a bachelor's degree at Yale University and a medical degree at Columbia University, where he also completed a residency in pediatrics. He completed a fellowship in pediatric endocrinology at UCSF. He will be presenting today on his research and interdisciplinary clinic work related to the biology of gender. Next, we will hear from Professor Lisa Fulham, Professor of Moral Theology at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University. Dr. Fulham teaches courses on fundamental moral theology and sexual ethics, and her research interests include virtue ethics, Thomas Aquinas, biomedical ethics, Ignatian spirituality, and the relationship of spirituality and ethics. She has completed a bachelor's degree and doctor of veterinary medicine at Cornell University and a master's and doctoral degree in theology at Harvard Divinity School. She will be presenting today on Catholic theological and ethical considerations around developing understandings of sex and gender. After these 2 contributions, we will then hear brief responses from 2 of our Benin Institute scholars, Dr. Maithri Jagathisan, Associate Professor of Anthropology, Associate Professor in the Anthropology Department at Santa Clara, and Dr. Sonia McKenzie, Assistant Professor in the Public Health Program here at Santa Clara. Additional members of our collaborative who will be supporting the dialogue to follow include Dr. Patrick Lopez Aguado, Assistant Professor in the Sociology Department, Stephanie Wildman, Professor Emerita in the SCU School of Law, and myself. Following the panel contributions, we'll take a few minutes, depending on where we are on time, to open up that dialogue at our tables around the issue of gender and gender justice raised by our panels. And then we'll open up the dialogue to Q&A with the panel and the rest of us. So let's get started. Please join me in welcoming all of our contributors and inviting Dr. Rosenthal to kick things off. Dr. Rosenthal, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharmila and Teresa. There you are. Thank you very much and everyone for the opportunity to participate in this. It's my first time down on the campus, but I got a really nice feeling just walking between the parking lot and here, and so very nice energy. But anyway, thank you. So my title is Biology of Gender Identity, Emerging Concepts, and we decided just at the very last minute that because I was the first speaker, that I should include a couple of definitions. So these are not included in my slides, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So when we define sex, which is always an interesting thing to do, but in the context of this particular roundtable, we're talking about the physical characteristics that would determine maleness or femaleness. And most of the time we're talking about the external genital structures, but we can also be talking about the internal genital structures, the gonads, meaning the ovaries or the testicles, or even the chromosomes, the XX for female and XY for male. That would be the definition of sex at those different levels. And in contrast, gender is an umbrella term which can include gender identity, gender behaviors, gender roles, etc. And when we talk about gender identity, we're talking about a person's fundamental inner sense of where they are or who they are as male or female or somewhere on that spectrum. And it's not something that you can see. What you might see is somebody's gender expression. And gender expression and gender identity are not always aligned. For example, if you think of what we sometimes refer to as a tomboy, someone who may not have any question at all about their female gender identity, but might express themselves in a way that might not be stereotypically female. So that's very different. So gender identity is what I'm going to be talking about in my 20 minutes here, okay? Again, gender identity meaning your inner sense of who you are, and it's not something you can see. The only way we ever know what someone's gender identity is to ask them. So if I've learned anything in the course of doing this work myself, that is to really question many long-held assumptions. And I always like to start out with this cartoon from the New Yorker where you see this adult and a child about to put a top hat on this snow creature that responds, well, what makes you assume that I'm a snowman, right? So gender identity is something inside, not something that you can see on the outside. So having done the definitions, what I'd like to do in my time here is to do two things: review the epidemiology of transgender, and then to review evidence for the role that biology plays in this. And I think that's something that has really interested me over the last number of years, and something that I think is important to get into the conversation when we talk about gender and transgender. And by the way, transgender is the definition of that would be when someone's gender identity is not aligned with their physical sex characteristics. And sometimes people, just two more definitions, sometimes people, at least before 2013, the official term for a person who was transgender and perhaps suffering from this was gender identity disorder. And in 2013, the American Psychiatric Institute dropped that term. They took away the word disorder and they changed it to gender dysphoria because they wanted to underscore the idea that being transgender in and of itself was no longer considered a mental illness, not a pathology, and that the focus should be on any suffering or distress that a person who is transgender might experience as a consequence of these challenges that they face, and that's called gender dysphoria. Okay, so these are the terms that will pop up in some of the next slides. So how common is this? This is a study that came out just earlier this year from UCLA, from the Williams Institute, which is part of the UCLA School of Law. And they looked at the prevalence of being transgender according to age. And you can see on the left column here, ages starting with adolescents all the way up to people my age, over 65. I won't tell you how much over, not too many years over. And then you can see the prevalence over here. And what you can see is that, and by the way, these data are derived from statewide population surveys and surveys from the CDC in Atlanta. And you can see that the prevalence in adolescents is about 0.7%, which means about 1 in 140. The lowest prevalence was 0.5 in senior citizens, which is 1 in 200. So this is not a rare thing. If you compare this to something like diabetes, which we're all very aware of, that has a prevalence of about 1 in 300 in the general population. So this is somewhat comparable to that. In our particular program that Teresa was introducing, we have now over 650 families that we serve, including many from this area that have come up, and saw our first patient in 2009, and we continue to get, on average, 10 to 12 new referrals each month of all ages, from as young as 3 all the way into the mid-20s. And every person that comes is not necessarily transgender, but they are seeking help in trying to figure out who they are and what services they might avail themselves of. So why is it even important to study the biology of gender identity? So the first thing I want to say is that the idea here is not to develop a litmus test, like a person has to prove what their gender identity is. I don't think we're ever going to get to that point, frankly. And those of us who've had the experience of working with transgender individuals know that many of them have had very negative experiences interacting with the healthcare system, because often they have to teach their medical providers about who they are and what their needs are. And a lot of people, it's just human nature, bring their own biases and perhaps misunderstandings to the situation. And often people end up feeling marginalized and not really respected. So when we talk about the biology, it's not to say, okay, here's the mechanism, let's try to fix it, okay? It's not to try to find a cure. It's really just to shed light on the fact that there very likely is biology that plays a role in this, and that your gender identity, much like your sexual orientation, which of course are two distinct aspects of human nature, are pretty much hardwired. You don't choose them. What you might choose is what you reveal, what you express to the outside world. So the idea is that hopefully by having this conversation about the biology, that this can be empowering, that knowledge can be empowering, that might just reinforce the idea that your gender identity, just like your sexual orientation, is not a choice, that hopefully this can promote increased understanding and then positively affect acceptance and quality of life. And of course, there are a very large number of people that are now appearing for services. So it's important that those of us that are interacting with these young people have an understanding of who we're interacting with. And then one of the other areas where gender comes up in the biomedical world is when the baby is born. You brought up the whole idea of an intersex condition. So these are not rare either. And this is when you look at the genitalia when the baby is born, and it doesn't look obviously male or female. All right, so in that event, it's typically a pediatric endocrinologist, which is what I do, that would be part of a multidisciplinary team that would be charged with trying to figure out what caused that intersex situation, and then how to treat the situation, and then how to raise the child. In fact, you often end up having to assist the family in guiding them on whether to raise them as male or female, and that's a whole separate discussion, which we could save for the Q&A if you'd like. But the idea here is that anything we could learn about the biology of gender in the broadest sense might also give us insights about how to think about intersex kids as well. Everybody has a gender, whether you're intersex or not, or transgender or not. So gender is not just about those people, it's about everybody. Okay, so what we know then is that gender identity is not simply a psychosocial construct. That somebody said, okay, these are males, these are females, and we're going to raise males this way and raise females this way, dress them this way, et cetera. It appears now that we can think about this in a different way, that it likely reflects a very complex interplay of biology as well as environmental and cultural factors. And so what is the evidence that biology plays a role in this process? So the evidence comes really from three biomedical disciplines. And I'm just very briefly going to give you some highlights here. Excuse me, in the genetics world, in the hormone world, endocrinology, and then some very interesting studies in the brain that support the idea that biology plays a role in all of this. And so I'm just going to show you one genetic study. And this is a study in twins. And the idea here is they had a number of twins. They had 23 pairs of identical twins, monozygotic identical twins, some which were female-female, some which were male-male. And then they had 28 pairs of non-identical twins, some of which were same-sex and some of which were opposite sex. And the question that was being asked was, first of all, in order to be in the study of the twins, one of the twins had to be, at least one of the twins had to be transgender. All right, so the question that the researchers were asking was, if one of the members in the twin pair was transgender, what was the likelihood that the other one would also be? That's what they're calling concordance, rather. And so what they found was, when they looked at the identical twins, there was a 39% concordance rate, okay? Meaning that if one was, there was a 39% likelihood that the other one would also be. If you looked at the non-identical twins, whether they were same-sex or opposite sex, there was 0% concordance. So this suggests that there is something in the DNA. And you might say, well, gee, if it's in the DNA, wouldn't you expect it to be higher than 39%? Well, we know that even people that share the same DNA, that there can be other mechanisms, epigenetic, they're called epigenetic mechanisms, that can influence which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off, okay? And that can vary between people even who share the same DNA. We also know that people may come to an understanding of who they are and reveal that to the outside world at different times in life, right? So it may be that if one were to do the same study at a later time, one might get even higher numbers. This just reminds me to mention what is probably obvious to you, which is that because there's no like blood test or DNA test to prove that somebody's transgender or brain scan, we're just depending on what someone tells us, there are two important limitations to consider in any one of these studies I'm reviewing, right? One is, what is that person's degree of self-awareness, and what is their willingness to disclose that, right? So we always have to keep those things in mind in this and all the subsequent studies. I would just say, to wrap up the genetics part, that at this point, even though there appears to be significant DNA evidence, or evidence that DNA plays a role, no one has been able to identify which gene or genes are responsible for this observation in the identical versus the non-identical twins. Nevertheless, 39% is significantly greater than 0%. What about endocrinology? So what I want to make sure people know is that what we have learned is that a typical, if there's such a thing, transgender person does not have any evidence of a hormone imbalance or an intersex situation. So we cannot pinpoint and say, okay, this is why that person ended up as transgender. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about some studies that were done in people with an intersex condition. The current term for intersex is DSD, which stands for differences or sometimes disorder, which is coming out of favor, that term. Differences or disorder of sex development is the current medical term for intersex. And the idea here is that there have been some very interesting studies in intersex individuals that have informed our understanding of the role that hormones can play in gender identity development. And so that's why I'm going to spend a couple of minutes and show you that. So what I want to do just really, really briefly first is on the right side of this slide here is a cartoon that shows the pathway of the physical development of the external genital structures. And so on the left side here is the female pathway, and on the right side is the male pathway. And the important point here is that every developing fetus starts out with the same set of external genital structures. And those structures will either become female or male. And in fact, every human is pre-programmed to have female development of the external genital structures unless that program is overridden by a signal. And that signal is the presence of the active form of testosterone called DHT, that's why I put it over here, and an androgen receptor. So testosterone or DHT is an androgen. Okay, and a fundamental principle in endocrinology, as I'm sure you know, in order to have hormone action, you need two things. You need to have a normal amount of the hormone, and you need to have a normal functioning hormone receptor. It's like a key going into a lock. You can only like open the door if you put the right key in the right lock. So it's the same thing. So if you've got this very potent male-like hormone around and a normal functioning testosterone receptor, the female external genital pathway will be converted into a male pathway. And what will happen is what would otherwise be the labia majora will fuse together in the midline and form a scrotum. What would otherwise be the labia minora will fuse together and form what's called the penile urethra, or the tract where the urine comes out in the penis. And what would otherwise be a clitoris will enlarge and become a penis. The only thing that determines that fate is just simply the presence of this potent form of testosterone. Now, in a typical developing baby boy, there are testicles there making testosterone. So that's why those structures masculinize. And in a female, because there's no testicles there, they end up with the female structures typically. But what I want to show you here is an example of a baby with an intersex condition. This turns out to be a genetic female. Now, you can't really tell much of anything from this slide here, but you can see this looks like a scrotum, right? But if you were to lift up this phallic structure, you would see that this looks halfway between labia and a scrotum, because the opening is actually right at the base of this phallic structure. So it's like an incompletely closed up labia into a scrotum. And this phallic structure is too big to be a normal clitoris, but too small to be a normal penis. So it turns out that this is a genetic female who has a condition that we screen for in every newborn baby throughout the United States called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. I'm not going to get into great detail, but this is an adrenal defect. So the adrenals sit on top of your kidneys, and the adrenals make adrenaline, cortisone, things that we've all heard of. Well, sometimes there can be a genetic condition in the adrenals where instead of making cortisone, they, by mistake, make testosterone. And if you're a male with this condition, you just end up with a little bit of extra testosterone, and it doesn't really change anything down below. But if you're a female with this condition that's not normally being exposed to testosterone in utero, then this is what you could end up with. Okay, so the question that I'm going to show you now in this particular study here is, what was the gender identity in genetic females who had this condition? In other words, their brains, their bodies and their brains were bathed in testosterone throughout their prenatal life and in the first few days or weeks after birth, before the diagnosis was made and treatment was started. And when you start treatment, by the way, you normalize the testosterone back down to a very low level, just to suffice it to say that. So in this study, they had 250 46XX female individuals, and when they studied them as adults, what they found was that 95% of them identified as female, 5% of them identified as male. And you might say, well, what's the big deal? That's just 1 in 20. But if you remember the prevalence data I showed you, 1 in 20 is about 10 to 20 times more common than what you would have expected to see in the general population. So this certainly says that prenatal androgen exposure is not everything, because if it was, you would have expected way more than 1 out of 20 to end up this way. Yet 1 in 20 is way more common than you would see in the general population, suggesting that male hormones do have an impact on gender identity development. I'm just going to skip this slide in the interest of time. And now I'm just going to go on to the last part of my talk, which is, what do we know about brain studies in terms of gender identity? So we've known for a long time that there are structures in the brain called sexually dimorphic brain structures, which means that every human has them, but there's usually 2 different shapes. And typically males will have one shape and females will have another shape. For example, I've listed a bunch here. For example, that you see here on the bottom of this list, the right putamen. So the putamen is a structure in the brain, and it happens to be twice as big in an average female than an average male, for example. Who knew? But it's an observation. There's another structure over here called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. That's typically twice as big in an average male than in an average female. Okay? It's also been known for more than 20 years now that there is at least one structure in the brain that segregates not according to your physical sex characteristics, like these other ones, but according to your sexual orientation. So here's one structure here that is significantly different in straight men than in gay men, okay? So then the question is, if there are brain structures that seem to segregate according to your physical sex characteristics, and at least one which segregates according to your sexual orientation, are there structures or functions in the brain which are aligned with your gender identity? So that's what I want to show you here. So just in the interest of time, I've summarized a number of studies on this one slide. A number of investigators have looked at some of these sexually dimorphic brain structures, like the right putamen, like the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis that I was just talking about. And they wanted to see whether, if you looked at transgender people, did they have the version of this structure that was more in alignment with their body or with their gender identity? And they looked at them even before they had any treatment with cross-sex hormones. And what they found was overwhelmingly their structures lined up with the structure that matched their gender identity much more closely than the structure that matched their genital structures. And here's one study that Teresa asked me to include. This is a study that just came out a couple of years ago where they looked at 1,400 human brains, and they weren't, shall I stop? Okay, all right. I just have a couple more slides. Okay, so basically this is a study that looked at 1,400 human brains, and instead of focusing just like on one particular sexually dimorphic structure, they looked at the entire brain and divided it up into the 10 regions in the brain that were most different between males and females. And what they wanted to know was, of these 1,400 people, about 700 were males, 700 were females. And these were not people that were necessarily transgender. In fact, very few of them were. Right? Because if the prevalence is 1 in 200, only about 7 of these people out of 1,400 would be transgender. So this is a study in non-transgender people. And what they asked was, if they looked at all 10 of these different regions of the brain and they took the men over here and the women over here, how often did the men always have the male version for all 10 of those structures and the females always the female version? They found that happened about 6% of the time. The vast majority of the time, males and females had some structures more commonly seen in men and some more commonly seen in women. And so this kind of blows away the idea that there's a male brain and a female brain and suggests that there really is a spectrum of maleness and femaleness when it comes to the brain in a very non-binary way. So just wanted to get that in there. And then the last couple of really 2 more studies, a smell test. Okay, so it turns out that you can have people smell these different compounds, the odors, and you can look at blood flow in the brain. Okay, so they used in this particular study a compound that's in male sweat, semen, and saliva. Okay, and then something from the urine of pregnant females, and they had people smell this, and it turns out that females, when they smell this stuff from men, they get an activation of blood flow. And when males smell the urine of pregnant females, they get the activation in blood flow. And it doesn't work the other way. So there is this sexually dimorphic response to this smell test. So they took 12 male to female adults who were not yet treated with estrogen, and they did the smell test on them. And even before being treated with estrogen, they had the female pattern. And then the last smell test study here, they did the same thing in adolescents, not just adults. And so you can see they only used the male cocktail here. And what they found was that control girls, so these are non-transgender adolescent girls, they had a stimulation in blood flow, and control transgender boys had a dampening of the blood flow when they smelled this stuff. And when they took transgender adolescents and compared them to the controls, again, you see the controls here, the girls with a stimulation, the boys with a dampening. If you looked at boys who identified as girls but had not yet been treated with estrogen, you can see they had the exact same pattern as seen in the control girls. And the girls who identified as boys, which we would call transgender boys, even before being treated with testosterone, they already had the same brain function as the control boys, suggesting that there is some intrinsic brain difference in someone who is transgender. And the very last study I will show you is this mental rotation task. As we know that there are different parts of the brain that light up when you do a mental rotation task. And so what they did here was they took 21 natal females, but that identified as males, but had not yet been treated with testosterone. So they identified as boys, but not yet treated with testosterone, and they did controls of boys and girls, and they wanted to see how their brains would light up compared to the controls. So if you look at control girls on the bottom here, this is both sides of the brain, and control boys, both sides of the brain. You can see that in the girls, there are some other areas that light up in the temporal and frontal areas that don't seem to light up so much in the boys. And if you look at the girls who identify as boys but had not yet been treated with testosterone, we would call these people transgender boys. You can see that their pattern in the brain is much more similar to the boys than to the girls, and they have not yet even been treated with sex hormones, again suggesting that there are variations in brain development. It's part of human diversity, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, nice. Hi. It is a delight to be here at the mothership down from Berkeley today. So I am very grateful to be able to be with you here today. I am going to take you from vast generalizations about Catholic moral tradition and hopefully funnel us down very quickly to some precise questions about trans identity and sexual orientation as they're understood in Catholic moral tradition today, with generous quotations from Pope Francis, because what the heck. Here we go. First of all, Catholic moral tradition. Morality must be based in reality. Or, in other words, Roman Catholic moral tradition, Roman Catholic tradition generally, is not fearful of science. In fact, Roman Catholic tradition regards the natural world as one aspect of God's revelation, and our human capacity to understand creation is also revelatory. Roman Catholic sexual ethics, like everything in Roman Catholic ethics, is based in natural law, which is one of the most frequently misdefined and misunderstood categories. You want to know more about natural law? Come up to Berkeley next spring. We'll do an entire semester on sexual ethics, talk a lot about natural law. Natural law is human reason reflecting on human nature to glean moral insight. Or it's not a parts list. Rather, a natural law argument is, in its structure, an ongoing dialogue about what it means to flourish as the kind of creatures that we are. It's also teleological, looking again to the future. What do we hope for, both in our near-term future socially and individually, but also looking toward the kingdom of God that Jesus preached. Now, from the vast overview, let's go down to sexuality. Sexuality is defined in the Catechism really rather beautifully. Sexuality, the Catechism says, affects all aspects of the human person in the unity of body and soul. It especially concerns affectivity, the capacity to love and to procreate, and in a more general way, the aptitude for forming bonds of communion with others. That's what sexuality is. Now, the current state of the teaching regards sex acts, not sexuality, but sexual acts, as licit only within heterosexual marriage when each sex act is open both to the possibility of procreation. You don't have to procreate, you don't even have to want to procreate, but it has to be open to the possibility that procreation might occur, and it has to be an act of love between the partners. That's humanae vitae. When it comes down to sex acts, though, the teaching of the magisterium has focused on that procreative aspect rather than on that love aspect. And this is a fact that Pope Francis laments in his recent post-synodal apostolic exhortation. So for those of you who are kind of document geeks, that's the kind of document it is, Amoris Laetitiae. The Pope says, "We often present marriage in such a way that its unitive meaning, its call to grow in love, and its ideal of mutual assistance are overshadowed by an almost exclusive insistence on the duty of procreation." Church teaching on sex also is based on the notion of a very clear sex and gender binary of male masculine and female feminine, where sex is determined by the appearance of one's genitalia at birth. There's really no church teaching on trans people at all. There have been some insults, but very few actual, next to no actual doctrine. There is a concern on the part of both Pope Francis and his predecessor, Benedict XVI, about the risk of embracing a gender ideology. It's a little tough to pin down what is meant by gender ideology, but here's what the current Pope says about this in that same document, Amoris Laetitia. He says, "Yet another challenge is posed by the various forms of an ideology of gender that denies the difference and reciprocity in nature of a man and a woman and envisages a society without sexual differences, thereby eliminating the anthropological basis of the family. This ideology leads to educational programs and legislative enactments that promote a personal identity and emotional intimacy radically separated from the biological difference between male and female. Consequently, human identity becomes the choice of the individual, one which can also change over time. Ellipsis, it needs to be emphasized that biological sex and the sociocultural role of sex can be distinguished but not separated." So, 3 things going on in that passage. First, it is important that the sexes be distinguished. This teaching does a lot of work for the church, especially around questions of ordination. Right? Second, sex identity should not be regarded, the Pope says, as the choice of an individual, but as connected to one's biological sex. And third, biological sex and gender, by which the Pope means the social roles connected to masculinity and the social identity of oneself as masculine or feminine, not the same thing as gender identity, which is closer to sex. We can discuss that later if you'd like to. One's biological sex and one's social roles as people of this or that sex are connected. They're not the same thing, but they're connected. So what I find interesting is that while Francis has not spoken definitively, that is, in a document with a high level of papal authority regarding trans people, it seems to me that trans people would wholeheartedly agree with these 3 points. Indeed, given the rate at which trans people are abused and attacked, they put their lives on the line for these principles. The difference between Catholic ethical tradition and a strong pro-trans stance rests entirely on how we think about biological sex. The notion that sex is a strict binary we just saw is not credible. The notion that you can read biological sex by looking at a baby's genitals we just saw is not credible. It simply isn't true. And if, as Catholics, we're in the business of pursuing truth as a reflection of the one truth that's in God's mind, revealed to us in the created order, we must respect the work of biologists, psychologists, historians, and of course, the experience of the people of God as we strive to live good lives. In a comment, not a formal document, just a comment in an interview, Pope Francis has said, "Life is life, and things must be taken as they come. Sin is sin. Inclinations or hormonal imbalances cause many problems, and we need to be careful when claiming all cases are the same. We need to embrace and study each case, accompany the person, discern and integrate them. This is what Jesus would do today. But please," he went on, "don't go and say now the Pope is going to sanctify transsexuals. I can just picture the front pages of the newspapers," he said. "It's a human problem, a moral problem, and we need to resolve it as best we can, always with God's mercy and with truth, but always with an open heart." Now, a little bit about conscience. One of the rare absolutes in Catholic moral tradition is respect for conscience. Francis says about conscience, also in Amoris Laetitia, required reading if you haven't read it. He says, we also find it hard to make room for the consciences of the faithful, who very often respond as best they can to the gospel amid their limitations and are capable of carrying out their own discernment in complex situations. We have been called to form consciences, not to replace them. And in the context of discerning what one is to do if one finds oneself remarried without annulment, which was the big controversial aspect of Amoris Laetitia, He wrote, this is a little long, but it's worth hearing. He said, recognizing the influence of such concrete factors, we can add that the individual conscience needs to be better incorporated into the Church's praxis in certain situations which do not objectively embody our understanding of marriage. Naturally, every effort should be made to encourage the development of an enlightened conscience, formed and guided by the responsible and serious discernment of one's pastor, and to encourage an ever greater trust in God's grace. Yet conscience can do more than recognize that a given situation doesn't correspond objectively to the overall demands of the gospel. It can also recognize with sincerity and honesty what for now is the most generous response which can be given to God, and come to see with a certain moral security that it is what God himself is asking amid the concrete complexity of one's limits, while not yet fully the objective ideal. In any event, let us recall that this discernment is dynamic. It must remain ever open to new stages of growth and to new decisions about which can enable the ideal to be more fully realized. That's what he says about conscience, and that's with regard to what had been an absolutely clear teaching of the Church for centuries about divorce and remarriage. Just a word about homosexuality, same-sex sexual orientation. The basic teaching is rooted in exactly the same way. Sexual orientation itself is not a sinful thing, and Catholics are taught that we must avoid every sign of unjust discrimination. That's in the Catechism too. At the same time, same-sex acts are regarded as always wrong because they are regarded as not meeting the criterion that Pope Francis says we overemphasize, the possibility of procreation. When the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the people in charge of doctrine at Rome, released its document opposing marriage equality, their principal points, they had 4 principal points, and all of them keyed back to procreation. This should really irk, among other people that this might irk, this should really irk straight people. Since straight marriage then has been defined as socially important because of the possibility of procreation. I'm a veterinarian. That's how we talk about livestock, not how we talk about people. It also reverses the clear teaching of Vatican II, in which marriage's end or purpose of love was seen as equal with the purpose of procreation. They also, at Vatican II, they affirmed the dignity of non-procreative but loving marriages, but did not affirm as marriage those procreative but not loveless arrangements that you can imagine. Now, just a word about justice in conclusion. According to Thomas Aquinas, justice means the perpetual and constant will to render to each their due. The first thing that is due to every human person is respect. Respect, though, isn't merely an abstraction. It's a matter of listening with humility to the stories we tell about our lives, especially how we strive to love as well as we can, especially when we talk about such central aspects of ourselves as our gender identity. This stance of humble listening, which I think in this document Pope Francis is trying to demonstrate, must then lead us to ask the key question. Are queer people, big umbrella term, are queer people being treated with justice in the Church? Have church leaders been willing to revisit questions on sexuality in light of science and experience? If not, why are we abandoning one of the highlights of our moral tradition, that the life experience of the people of God, along with science and art and history and literature and all the other ways that we seek truth? Why are we abandoning the notion that all of that are avenues by which God, in God's own self, is revealed to us? Thanks.
Good afternoon. my title slide. Thank you to both of our speakers so much for your thoughtful, kind of big picture biology to moral ethical questions here. So many important questions. And on the note of listening with humility, I'm going to bring us to some of the data from my recent gender justice research project. So as part of my participation in this Benin Gender Justice Faculty Collaborative, I've had the great pleasure of doing some research with children aged 5 to 11 years old in a Bay Area elementary school to ask children about gender. Okay, so, oh, there, it popped up. So we know actually that almost 10% of children in elementary schools identify as gender expansive. Not transgender, but gender expansive. So not necessarily fitting into categories of either boy or girl, okay? So we brought together a group of 14 children in the spring who identified as gender expansive, also transgender, and children who are in LGBTQ parented families, okay? And a group of their friends at their request. They wanted their buddies, of course, their kids. So we wanted essentially to kind of have a broad interrogation with children and to hear from them, children who have some version of a quote-unquote non-normative experience of gender, either in family structure through parents or in their own experience as a young person, as a child. A kindergarten teacher was my community collaborator in this CBPR, community-based research project. And we drew on a methodology in public health called Photovoice. How many people here have heard of Photovoice? Any Photovoice people? Essentially, it's a mechanism for hearing from communities wherein we give cameras to people, and then we, together with these communities, develop questions that are relevant to their lives, and then they go explore these various questions through visual imagery. Okay, so each child in this group was given a camera for 12 weeks and asked to go out into their lives and document gender. Okay. Oh, somehow the visual part of this is gone. There was a curriculum that the kindergarten teacher came up with, doing some work around both kind of exploring cameras and functions. The cameras themselves were very exciting for children because they had all sorts of bells and whistles, and so they got to play with those. And then also really kind of breaking down culture, also gender, talking with kids and giving them clear definitions and about gender, hearing from local high school students, gender messaging, and such. So what I'm going to do is essentially present you with 5 brief young people, both their image and then the methodology of Photovoice. We actually sit down with the individual, so with each child, and then we ask them to narrate what does that image actually mean to them. So then they develop a narrative that essentially frames what that image is. For the first 2, I'm going to include an audio clip of the child narrating, in the first case, actually not this image, but here we hear how this particular child feels that she came into an awareness of gender. And I think if I do this, we're going to hear it.
When I first realized my gender, I was a nurse.
Is there a way to... I'm going to pause it for a second. Hang on. I don't think anyone can hear this except for me, right?
Oh, no.
Do you know if there's a way to...
Girls on this side and girls on that side.
Okay.
And so I just went to the girls' side, and I guess I just figured out how to go.
Did anyone hear any of that? A little bit? Okay. So essentially, nursery school, they line you up, boys, girls, and I think that was essentially how I came to realize that I was a girl. Go figure. I was told to inhabit a category, and therefore I chose a category. We're going to hear from one of our gender-expansive children. And again, listen carefully so you can hear this young gender-expansive kindergartner. Sorry.
I was born as a boy. I'm half boy, half girl.
How does it make you feel when people tell you who you are?
Kind of sad.
Because why?
Because they make me go into the girls' bathroom, but I just wait.
Why do you wait?
And I wait until they leave so that they don't see and then tell on me.
Could people hear that? So here's a kindergartner who identifies as half boy, half girl, who is regulated around going to the bathroom as a kindergartner and therefore does not go to the bathroom all day because of fear of being surveilled and the repercussions and made fun of. And I should add, on an uplifting note, that we like to think in part as a result of this project, the school over the summer added 2 all-gender bathrooms, and all the kids in this project essentially have assumed personal responsibility for being part of that, because all of the children in this group really got to hear from the transgender and gender-expansive kids about the impact on their lives and hear these words, and became incredible allies for gender justice. I want to briefly, I know our time is so limited, but can I do a couple more? One more. Okay, then we won't listen to this, we'll briefly go over it, but here is a young second grade ally who essentially is putting forward the need for all gender bathrooms, okay, with very, very clear, articulate language, standing up for her friend. Oh, somehow this got messed up in translation. We also heard from a parent, and I think I'll bring us to the final quote, "Gender is in your heart."
When my Uncle Zach walks into a room, sometimes people mistake him for a girl. Then he will tell them that he's actually a boy. Even after he tells them his pronoun, people still say she, her, hers. That makes him feel pretty annoyed and maybe a little bit angry and sad. If you're going to use somebody's pronouns, you should always ask them or just use they. Gender is in your heart, not in other people's heads. Uncle Zach wants transgender kids to know that there are lots of transgender adults around that love them and want to give them support. He wants you to know that you can be who you are and to find people who understand you and love you and see you for who you are, your allies. Your allies are here to help you advocate for what you need.
Okay, so young children are themselves reaching out to trans adults, essentially, and trans adults are reaching out to children across generations with understandings around the need for allyship. So in closing, I'd just say, coming back to this, listening to the voices of hearing from children has been incredibly eye-opening for me as we really try to move toward creating gender-inclusive environments for kids, not just youth, right? There's a lot of work with youth in high schools. Apparently gender is something that youth have, but kids also are being socialized, and schools are powerful spaces through which these norms of gender are created and reinforced. And so that's what we're currently starting to do, is expand into more schools with this kind of work. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm not going to take more than 5 minutes just to quickly wrap things up. So I'm a little bit of the anomaly in this panel. I'm a cultural anthropologist that works in Sri Lanka and not in the United States. So I'm going to bring a perspective to kind of put the 3 papers together, or the 3 presentations together, and hopefully generate some conversation for our table discussions. So I work on transitional justice in post-war Sri Lanka and the International Center for Transitional Justice. And I'm going to ask us to kind of be creative and think about applying this to the papers we heard today, are the ways in which emerging countries that are emerging from periods of conflict and or repression address large-scale or systematic violations of justice to individuals both as humans and citizens that are so numerous and so serious that the normal justice system will not be able to provide an adequate response. And so I was thinking about how can we be radical enough to take something that is an international human rights mechanism and think about our own sort of archive of gender justice in this very country. I believe we are in a period of transition. I like to think a year after an election in which we know a number of sort of gender justice violations took place during the campaign. As a year later, as we stand here today, it gives me hope that we can have a full room thinking about gender justice. But at the same time, thinking about where is that threatened and what kinds of accountability mechanisms do we have in place and what is adequate within our own systems, our own economies of gender justice. And as an anthropologist, I'm drawn to sort of this idea of senses of self. I think about and using kind of thinking of Sonia's term as gender expansive, and also Stephen talking about different ways of sense of self. How do we know this? Visibility. William James has an idea of the sense of self as not only being material, social, and spiritual. So these three senses of self. And so when Teresa, you're talking about the way in which Susanna Cornwall talks about, the individuals being both embodied, God imaging, and godly made. So embodied, material, spiritual, God imaging, and then godly made, the social, right? Fabricated and made. And I had questions to kind of think with Stephen's first question about gender identity and sending that definition, right? It's what's inside, it's not visible. And the only way, to use your language, the only way we can know is to ask them. And I want to think about that context then in sort of where are we then when someone's not willing to disclose, when they discern the social and when they see that the actual conditions are not safe enough to disclose. Just given on November 1st, GLAAD, the advocate, you may have seen this, right? 23 transgender individuals have been killed by violent means in the United States just this year, as of October 31st. 2 of whom were the exception, the rest were transgender individuals of color. And so to think about the intersections of that, when we know our histories, we know our present realities of violence or injustice, which are very much embedded in structures, institutions, and economies. How then do we get a sense of disclosure? And to kind of think about Lisa's comment about respect of conscience. In the transitional justice mechanism, it's the idea, and it really much goes with this, that we form conscience, but not to replace them, right? So we know that what we had in the past, it's a question of temporality, what we had in the past was not adequate. So how can we come together in moments in time of solidarity to say, what do we have? What are the resources we have? And when do those resources get threatened? And so I have just 2 questions to kind of put this together. What are those economies of gender justice that operate in our society, in which we must define, perform, and articulate our senses of self in the context of gender and sexuality? And in those economies of justice, what's the currency of the languages that we use? Right? We're coming from various disciplines, and is there a convergence or a possibility of converging types of language where we can help one another understand various perspectives that are embedded in that self? What's the evidence that we have? We heard so many different types of evidence, right? Visual, we have scientific, we have very much different types of languages. But what's that data that actually helps us support that? And then lastly, to think then, what are the constraints on our resources? What is the legislation in our government, policymakers? And then to also think about curriculums over time. It's not just one teacher, but over time, what's going to be the lasting impact across ages to understand this? When you talked about the adults in this larger study, what would be that? And my second question then is, what do spaces of solidarity around gender justice look like? What do they require? What are those accountability mechanisms? What are the support systems that could ensure the dignity of the self? And then how are they threatened? When are they fragile? and to kind of maybe help us generate through an interdisciplinary dialogue around justice what is possible. And I see that from sort of an international perspective in which things like intersex, transgender, and other types of unions, bonds are criminalized in Sri Lanka where I work. And so to kind of think about knowing individuals from child's ages to older women that have gone through these experiences without the support of constraints, science, even study to kind of talk about this, but thinking about how we can kind of put that together. And then I'll end. So thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentations. As I listen to you all, and I'm trying to wrap my, well, there's one thing about, I guess, gender identity that has always bothered me, gender and sexual identity, is the notion that it's not a choice. And so I guess the question that I'd like to pose is it possible that gender identity and sexual identity is a choice? And if it is there anything wrong with that?
I hardly feel like I'm an expert. I don't think anybody can prove definitively that one way or the other. I mean, I think I think most people have come to the real. People have attempted reparative therapy, for example. We know that there are certain brain functions that can change with life experiences. There are some fascinating. Can you hear me on this? Is it working? There are some fascinating brain imaging studies where you can do a before and after people learning how to juggle. And you can show, if you image the brain at those two different time points, you can show obvious changes in the gray matter and the white matter, often of the magnitude that is referenced in some of the brain studies I was talking about. But that just because some parts of the brain are amenable to training or life experience, it doesn't mean that every aspect is. And I know that I was certainly not prepared to talk about the outcomes of reparative therapy when it comes to sexual orientation, but I certainly have heard a lot about it, and I have never heard any convincing evidence that it's anything other than ineffective and very likely to be harmful. So I have heard similar observations made about applying reparative therapy to people's gender identity as well. But I don't think I have anything else really to say about that.
There have certainly been situations in history in which women have assumed male identity, but generally that's not a question of how they think of themselves as much as it is social perks, right? So a woman might try to pass as male to enter in the 7th, 8th, 10th century, a Franciscan friary, or must have been the 13th century, Franciscan friary. And I would look to the witness of trans people and queer people themselves, that if gender identity were a choice, they're putting a heck of a lot on the line for a simple choice, right? And similarly with gay people, the rates of violence against gay and trans people themselves say, if this is a simple choice, like what color shall I wear today, right? It's it doesn't make any sense, and it also doesn't fit with their experience as they describe it. Now, what difference would it make if it were a choice? That's a great question, because if gender identity were a choice, then at least in the moral scene, we would ask those larger questions about, okay, what about flourishing? What about individual, social, and that teleological long-term flourishing? And there I think we would begin to uncover more layers of how other kinds of discrimination, like sexism and heterosexism, have infiltrated our social discourse.
Just to add briefly, I think I appreciate your question because in many ways it exposes the ways in which I think we often rely on biological explanations as quote unquote truth, right? And so your question for me raises, well, if it is a choice, is it no less quote unquote truth, right? And do we not also have the kind of moral and ethical imperative to continue to support people? So in some ways, for me, your question begs the question, you know, where do we have to assume responsibility as a society, right? And in many ways, I do think that the, oh, well, you know, gay brains are such, or, you know, that this is not a choice argument has been put forward to maybe avoid these, I think, very pressing questions related to persistent stigma and discrimination. So I'll leave it at that so we have time for other questions, because I know we're coming up on time.
If you want to uproot this problem, I was just wondering what each of you thinks the historical background and reasoning behind saying that person's a male, that person's a female, it's as simple as that, where that comes from. What's the basis and the reasoning behind that simple thinking about it? Just as a way of understanding where the thinking was rooted in historically, so you can understand how to move it forward.
I can try this one. Better? Okay. When you think about sort of the historical, you know, the development of categories, right? Why are categories so useful, and for whom, right? Categories are useful for people who have power, right? Because they were meant to sort of, when you think in the sort of Frantz Fanon sense and colonization, right? We create people who are colonized, and we are the colonizers. So we create people who have a certain set of rights, responsibilities, commitments, and entitlements. And then we create those who maybe have a different set, possibly better rights, responsibilities, and entitlements. So it's a question of power relations. Why are they so effective at maintaining structures and institutions of power? And then I think what we've seen over time is an evolution of those categories, but it's still, there's a lot of tension within what's actually possible, the constraints to things that we cling to, right, that are sort of really vitally active categories that we, maybe it's hard for us to shake off, but at the same time our institutions also deserve a little bit of pressure to then maybe abandon those categories as well. But it's a question of what is possible, and I think idea of potential, and seeing within sort of theological but also anthropology, science, ways that we can maybe abandon categories that we once defined our very own disciplines and studies. Is that possible? But that's a question of working together.
I would also maybe just add to that given the evidence that I shared with you, that biology plays a role in gender identity development. It has made me wonder, is there some evolutionary reason why there would be these differences? And also why there might be diversity, right? There's diversity in virtually every aspect of being human, so we shouldn't be surprised that there might also be diversity when it comes to gender identity or sexual orientation. But it would seem to me that there probably are evolutionarily compelling reasons to have people who not just look like or have the body parts, of course your brain is part of your body parts, but that identify as a male, and the roles that, now I'm talking about roles as opposed to identity, I realize, but that, because typically roles and identity are aligned, that males would play in life and females would play. And there are certain cultures in the South Pacific, I think like the Fa'afafine, I don't remember, is that Tahiti, or it's somewhere in the South Pacific, where there are people that are recognized and celebrated actually from a very early age as being different, not fitting into a binary of male and female. They're just accepted and celebrated, in fact, and they play particular roles in society. So it may be that there's an evolutionary reason for that too, but it's suppressed in more sort of religiously dictated cultures.
I think that there were two.
Okay, two more questions.
Hi. Sort of off that, so I've done a little bit of work in a couple different developing countries having to do with gender, both like on the ground and here as well. And I kind of have a question about what is the role for us as people of comparatively enormous amounts of privilege in acting as allies for members of society who are marginalized in other countries, and as well as in our own, in different areas of the U.S., kind of like what we can do in a culturally appropriate way.
Great question. I think, and I work with a number of feminists in Sri Lanka. We have a Facebook group that's Feminist Conversations, and right now, when we think about sort of LGBT communities in Sri Lanka, it's still criminalized, yet there are things like pride celebrations. We talk about trans experiences, but then there's no sort of actual infrastructure on a health level to even encounter this, right? Or if it's done under the table. People who are intersex as well, that's also a question. I think listening is very important. Going into Sri Lanka, I know I often do have to listen and ask questions to say, what resources do you have? Where are spaces that are safe to talk about certain issues? Who are your allies in these situations? But also, what's possible in terms of potential transnational connections that could then put pressure on certain actors that are maybe constraining individuals' experiences of gender and expression. So it's interesting to think. I mean, there are obvious systems and relations of power for you coming in and working with communities, but listening is so important. And part of anthropology is ethnographic and understanding people from their perspectives. So, yeah.
We have time for one more.
One more brief question. Yeah, I know we're at time, so we'll just hear this question and maybe a brief response, and then anyone who has further questions, if you would be willing to stay for just a few more minutes to be able to engage, we'll offer that.
Okay, this may not, I'll keep the question brief, but the answers might be more complicated. Isn't there a risk, there's so much of the discussion lately about gender justice is about trans issues, and trans people, according to Stevens statistics, are 0.7% of the population. What concerns me is the shift to focusing so heavily on that and ignoring global female infanticide, rape against cisgender women, domestic violence against cisgender women, not only cisgender women, but women in general, that it seems like the conversation in our culture and in a lot of disciplines now is focused so heavily on issues of transgender people that the focus on women is getting lost even among scholars who consider themselves feminists.
I completely agree and respect what you're saying. I think just from my perspective, because this is relatively new even to me, I've been at UCSF for 38 years, so this represents the last quarter of my time there. There's a very high rate of suicidal attempt and actual suicide in the transgender population. And I think that is really what moves us. So it's certainly not to the exclusion of what you're talking about, but this seems to be, there's a certain urgency there. And again, it's not one or the other. And I completely agree that we shouldn't just focus on 7.7% of the population, but I think this is sort of the first time that small percentage of the population has gotten the kind of awareness that it has now. And so I think things, I think certainly in the news, with all of the unfortunate behavior towards cisgender women, or to women, could be transgender women as well, for all we know. So I think I think one actually benefits the other, because I think the more people talk about justice, we realize that it's not just about one issue or one group of people within an issue.
I would just add to that, I think that the Kids Project is an example, actually, where we have kids who are essentially cisgender, heterosexually parented kids who really have never even thought about gender in their lives or family structures, but they're really coming to an understanding that we all have genders, right? We all have these states of being, and I see them as actually very related. And I think that the way to support trans communities is actually for cisgender people to understand what gender is, and for us to, fight back against gender violence that cisgender women face around the globe, it is also for that kind of work to happen. So I see a lot of room and space for solidarity here and shared conversations and really thinking intersectionally about these.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for your contributions, and please join me in thanking our panel for their very layered and significant contributions. As you depart, if you could take a minute to fill out our evaluation card, we always appreciate that feedback. And also, if you haven't had a chance to do so, check out our podcast, Integral, where you can hear more from the panelists who are here today and some that weren't able to share on the panel. So you can find that on our website. And thank you all very much for coming.